We're going to begin. We're very happy and privileged that Yonasan is on our team, and he is a mumchi in ACT. He can tell you exactly how he knows all about ACT. Spending hours and hours reading, and he uses it a lot.
Reading and acting.
Reading and acting. I'm supposed to be working the slides, so I hope I do a decent job. As you all know, I did the ACT boot camp in the summer, so I'm looking forward to the review, and it's pretty impressive because in order to prepare for the boot camp, I had to learn RFT. Well, I told myself I had to learn RFT, which is Relational Frame Theory, which is very cumbersome to understand. And Yonasan showed me a presentation he'd done before, and I said, you made this much more clear. It is important to understand the basics of it because ACT is built on RFT, and they did a lot of research on it in order to show its effectiveness based on relational frame theory, which is really very interesting, and you can read all 11 chapters like I did if you ever want to know and see how much you actually remember like I do. But I feel good that I actually did that.
How dedicated of you.
Yeah, I'm kind of like that.
Those of us that have really bad, like cold eyesight, you can make the frame.
So there's a second handout.
There are two
That's
handouts.
this guy.
Yeah,
It's the same.
they're similar.
Okay.
Different formats for different
For some
learning
people- some old
styles.
people.
Yes, it's for different learning styles. They're basically the same tiny differences, but it's good to read things over more than once. So I turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Very good. All right, let's rock and roll. So I apologize ahead of time. There's definitely a nerd alert with this presentation.
Yes, it's very much like
Big
that.
nerd alert. Because ACT, first of all, ACT is very technical. It's coming out of the behavioral tradition. So already those guys have their own vocabulary, their own language. And even for the behavioralist, all of the different theoretical advances in the lab research that our buddies from the RFT branch have done is just phenomenally more complicated. So if I say something that sounds weird, ask, and then we can kind of move on from there. But like I said, major nerd alert.
Oh,
That's better.
So ACT, what's ACT? So ACT's a third wave psychotherapeutic approach. We're going to talk a little bit about what that is in the presentation. And it's rooted, like I said, in the behavioralist tradition. What makes ACT very unique is, number one, it actually is coming out of a science of philosophy as its basis. And more than that, it's built from the ground up from basic developmental research. No other therapy can claim either. The behavioralists in the second wave can, but in terms of their practical, more pragmatic application in therapy, outside of institutions, they didn't have so much traction with technique. This coming out of the behavioral tradition is very much rooted in the basic lab research. What it's basically doing is it's extending Skinner's description of the verbal generalized operant, how we speak, how we learn how to speak. And Skinner, in his work, he really ran into a snag. How do you describe language? And in his verbal behaviors book, he does a fair job of doing it, giving different categories of speech, manding, echoing, all sorts of fun terms. But ultimately, it never ended up being something that was usable, that language was too difficult to grasp given the research at the time that was available and the work that he was doing, but was very much pioneering. So the relational frame theorists, the RFT guys, push forward this research from Skinner. ACT, coming out of this unique philosophy of science, being again, we'll get to that in a little bit, this contextual-based philosophy of science, and coming out of the lab research, they've developed and shown that 6 specific processes can be utilized to affect change. So we're going to discuss that. And what's really cool about ACT is it's a transdiagnostic approach. What that basically means is you can use ACT for any mental health issue. There's one other transdiagnostic approach that exists, David Berlau. He came up with something called the Unified Protocols for Transdiagnostic Treatment. That is the only other actual transdiagnostic approach that exists today. So
What's it called again?
Yeah, right. Unified Protocol of Transdiagnostic Treatment. With David Berlau, and it'll be right up there, one of the first things on his Wikipedia page, I bet. So that's really handy, being able to use ACT in multiple different ways, with different problems, different manifestations of human suffering. Great. So today's lecture, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be describing, like I said, what these 3 waves of psychotherapy were. How did we get to today? We're going to define what functional contextualism is as a philosophy of science, and how is that different from the philosophy of science that things like cognitive behavior therapy was coming from, which is a mechanistic philosophy of science. And we're going to really deal with, well, why do we even care? Why is that important when it comes to treatment? You know, philosophy is interesting and nice, but pragmatically, what do I do with it? One of the unique features of a contextualistic philosophy of science is the only relevant question is, does this dog hunt? Does this actually do something in a hands-on pragmatic way? So it's Shaykh. It is very much important to get this one down. We're going to review the development of ACT, RFT. We're going to cover the 3-term contingencies, why that's not enough to describe human behaviors, and understanding rule-governed behavior as a result of the fact that we speak as human beings. So, you know, that all being said, I think it's kind of important to note that when you look at the world of psychology, until RFT, there was never a philosophy of language in a therapeutic context. And you have people like Noam Chomsky who have developed.
I was just going to say Vygotsky,
right.
Chomsky.
You have people
right.
but they never developed a scientifically based. It's more humanistic. And Chomsky is amazing. In fact, Chomsky was one of the major criticizers of Skinner. He was the one who was pummeling him consistently, really showing the limitations of his research. So, like, we don't want to scoff at Chomsky, but it wasn't as though he developed a usable theory of language, especially something you can use clinically. So it's kind of funny noting that, because, like, as therapists, our primary therapeutic tool is not empathy, but is the fact we speak. It's more of a draw to jump towards the emotional content that we create between people, but the way that we do that is through our very words. And RFT is going to make a bold claim that language, that speech, is cognition, and that there's no practical difference between the two. And it's out of language, out of cognition, that empathy is developed. So when we get to the slides outlining the different aspects of relational frame theory, we're going to take a pause on how do you conceptualize empathy, and how can you leverage that in the work that you do to increase it. The 3 waves of psychotherapy. So the first wave of psychotherapy was in response to the psychodynamic psychoanalytic tradition. Essentially, the 2 main criticisms that the behavioralists had against the psychodynamic folks was that, well, the work that they were doing, although profound, and later if you look at research from Frank and Frank, they had a research paper in 1982, I think it was, that showed that the effect size of different therapies are basically the same. So we can really justify, like, psychodynamic approach is not a silly approach, but the behavioralists had the difficulty of, well, what you guys are talking about is all well and good, but it's not rooted in observable science. And there really is no lab development showing how specific techniques can create change. If you want to read a cool book, Tauber, I think it's on Freud. It was something, I forget the title, something like the hesitant philosopher or something along those lines. Describes how Freud's basic approach to therapy was more of a philosophy, mixing the idea of Descartes' the thinking person, so a very vague definition of personality, a very vague definition of self, and being couched within the paradox of a Nietzschean idea of the will to being, and in using Kant's idea of reason as a tool to develop the will, so to speak, in a way where you overcome determinism and exercise free will. That's a really cool theory, but not something that's so easily researched in the lab. So those were the basic criticisms that the behavioralists had. So behavioralism set themselves up to be just that their techniques had to be rooted in proper research, and that the clinical work could not be a separate research endeavor. But there were limitations. Bandura, who you can kind of think of as almost like, riding the cusp between the cognitivists and the behavioralists, really singled out how there were major limitations to only dealing with a person's behavior, and that you need to be able to describe in a more effective way the cognitive elements, how a person thinks, which was very much lacking from the behavioralist traditions. Yeah.
So, how did Frankl sort of fit into all this? In other words, Bandura's coming from a CBT perspective, Freud is coming from a more psychodynamic perspective, and yet there were other perspectives that were looking at or humanism. Like, where did all that stuff fit into what you're describing now, or is that just not part of the game?
I'm not going to cover that so much. I mean, you can kind of lump those guys. They share
just
a
like
lot.
if you're making a timeline.
Yeah, you would lump them within the psychodynamic camp. A lot of overlap. There's more. I mean, existentialism by definition is dealing with the essence of being, which was very much what Freud was doing. So in terms of their actual philosophical goals, they overlap. Now there are big differences. And
There are these
huge differences.
Yeah.
Huge differences, but it's fair to actually put them in a similar conceptual camp. But you're right, yeah, they're different and they're cool, and it says as a derech agav, ACT oftentimes is lumped together as an existentialist approach, despite the fact it's pure behavioralist techniques. So we'll get to that a little later. Okay. Fine. So that was the second wave was arguing we have to put these things into research. We have to put these things into the clinical work that we do. We have to explain language. We have to explain cognitive processes. That has to be a part of the work that we do as therapists. So if we were kind of make a rough generalization of what are the cognitivists about, well, the basic idea is that feelings and behaviors are what motivates thought. They had a very linear way of looking at human behavior. This is definitely developed, that I think it's more fair to say that the cognitive behavioralists have come on to more of an ACT way of describing how these things are related, that behavior can lead into feelings and feelings can lead into thought, and it's not a linear progression, but the classic model is this way, that feelings and behaviors are motivated by thoughts. And it posits the idea that there are something called cognitive processes, and this is we're going to touch a little bit on this later when we develop the idea of the philosophy of science, but this is a very mechanistic worldview. It's an assumption that there are forces in the world that, almost like if you're pushing a button or cranking a lever, there's a force that causes a cause and effect cascade. That one action leads to another action, which leads to another action, but has a force that starts the whole thing. So something like that would be, say, schemas would be an example of this force that makes the whole machine of our brains move. Within the cognitive approach, thinking disturbances and biases, they are the causes of psychological disorders and not events in a person's life. Again, an unfair generalization, but since Beck actually writes it in page 2 of her manual on CBT, I'm going to say it. That's a direct quote. That there isn't so much of an emphasis on the environment, on the circumstances that surround an individual, and treatment is mostly going to be focused on the individual himself and how he is thinking about the world he's standing in. That the development, another way of kind of looking at the development of mental illness from a cognitive perspective is, we have these core beliefs. Again, those are the magic forces, the cognitive processes that underlie the whole machine, which lead to these intermediate beliefs, and they are manifested in situations in a person's life, and then you have automatic thoughts because of these situations that we live through, and that leads us to the reactions that we have of either having too much fear, too much pain, too much worry, whatever the problem's going to be. And I would say that the cognitivists are more open, even though they were more focused on the individual, were more open to environmental factors than, say, their predecessors, the psychodynamic camp. Okay. How are these two waves the same? So both put a huge emphasis on scientific research, using random controlled trials, really kind of poo-pooing all other types of research, which, there's a fair argument to say that's a huge mistake, and that the human experience can't necessarily be captured in those sort of research techniques. Both acknowledge the importance of behavior, but there's a distinction. From the behavioralists, behavior was their focus. That was the way they interpreted human experience, whereas the cognitivists don't look at behavior as a roadmap to life, but almost as a way of behaviors like the road signs on the road to life, which is how you think. So with the behavioral components of CBT would be, for example, all the experimental work. The point is not to get you to experience something new, but it's to get you to think differently when you think about what you do. And ultimately, the goal of psychotherapy for these two waves is to reduce psychological suffering. The focus being on the content of suffering, the symptomology of what a person is going through, and not the context. This is going to be the primary difference between the third wave and the second and first wave. That ACT or dialectical behavior therapy, other modalities are going to be almost exclusively focusing on the context of problem, not trying to change symptoms, not trying to reduce directly the manifestation of suffering, but how you relate to it. And finally, they're very much, because it's very symptoms-based, they're looking at psychological disorders as just that, disorders, that they're medical problems people suffer. So the failures of the second wave. What exactly motivated this new transition that we're currently in now in the world of psychotherapy? So number one is that cognitive behavior therapy and the cognitive psychology were actually two different fields. When you really get into cognitive psychology, the basic model you're going to be working under is the conceptualization of the mind as a computer, very Alexander Turing sort of stuff. And there's basically 4 different types of models, and it's really kind of like, how much do you want the mind to be a computer? Is it exactly like a computer? It's kind of like one would be a second variation. Is it metaphor? And then the more loosey-goosey cognitive model would be something like Piaget's work. But all very much centering around this idea that the mind is more or less functioning like a computer. It processes information. Whereas the CBT folks, all the research is coming out of clinical experience. It's more taking on almost as a philosophy, the idea that thoughts are important, and using experimentation, post hoc to kind of work backwards and develop the therapies that you're using. So Beck, especially now in his current work, he's trying to bridge that gap, and he's trying to, the last research paper he put out, amazing work, was very much focusing on biological structures, very much focusing on cognitive processes that are coming from cognitive psychology, and linking it with his work, but there's a huge gap. All his techniques really just came out of clinical experience, having nothing to do with cognitive psychology, funnily enough. Ellis, in the way that he presented his version of CBT, he was a lot more honest. He was just straight up, I'm coming out of Greek philosophy, and that's where I'm playing, which was, I think, a lot more accurate in terms of the presentation of where these things are coming from. The second problem that came up was the fact that there were just so many manuals that you have, there's a bazillion and one protocols you have to really go through if you want to be a proper CBT therapist. They have a manual for not just depression, anxiety, missing your dog, it's just everything and anything, and there are thousands of them. And it's so unwieldy to have to go through that work and learn these protocols. It would just be really great if we had fundamental processes to base our work on without having to go through so many manuals. Another point here is that as research was developing, there were so many unresolved anomalies in the research, things that as a cognitive behavior therapist you would never imagine to see. So a really cool paper, the Seattle Project. Whenever you have a paper that has a name, Seattle Project, you know it's going to be cool. Neil Jacobson, this was the last research project he did before he died, he and his team accidentally stumbled on the fact that they were doing deconstruction work on CBT, and so they had, like, well, what would be the outcomes of, say, somebody who has a full CBT project, cognitive emphasis, or just a behavioral emphasis, and they were kind of looking at the behavioral aspect as almost like that's the lame sort of, like, that's right next to the placebo. What ended up coming out was the behavioral component worked just as well as the full CBT. That was weird. So they did a second study that was more refined, trying to work out, well, how does things function, and they kind of gave a full behavioral approach, not just CBT's version of behavioralism, and it ended up being that a pure behavioral approach with no cognitive elements whatsoever was dramatically more effective in treating major depression than a full CBT approach. That even though if you couldn't reduce, as a second point, even if you couldn't reduce a person's depression to subclinical levels, you still had larger gains within therapy using a pure behavioral approach. So it's like, well, how do you explain that one? If depression is really, this was Beck's first book, depression being described as how we think about things. Well, if we can get rid of depression simply by acting different, well, how do you explain that one? So all these different factors were building up, demanding a new description of clinical psychology. Like I mentioned before, a huge philosophic shift. All the third wave behavioral approaches are contextual based. We don't care about reducing symptoms, although that's really nice, and happens to be just as effective as if you're actually trying to reduce symptoms. But the main objective is to create new meaning around the pain that one is experiencing. So it's actually a difficult research question to kind of get around your head, because, well, they're just as effective in reducing symptoms, but what people are finding is that this is a genuinely different process to change, where you can actually have a person come in and they're suffering from major depression. You give them the Beck assessment, and they're scoring high up there. You go through a contextualistic approach, changing the way they relate to their pain, and by the end of it, they're leading amazing lives. They feel great. They on a in their bones sort of way feel like, man, therapy was a success. Their lives are on track. And if you were to give them a Beck assessment, it could very well be they're still just as depressed, but the way they relate to it is dramatically different. So you have both processes of change from a contextualistic perspective. Yeah.
So what are you going for then? Are you going for an actual change in the way people think? Are you going for an actual change the way people relate to the pain? In other words, let's say Plonit has been in my office for 10 years talking about the same to-do.
Yeah.
I'm giving up on trying to fix the way she talks about her situation, and I'm just trying to get her to act differently through feeling better about the fact that she still wants to kill herself. I'm just like I'm trying to put it down into practical terms.
So there's going to be some variation with DBT, let's say. There is some room in DBT for targeting symptoms. The problem DBT is kind of tackling is you don't want the person to die now, but ultimately you're working towards a contextualistic change. So you might be using a more Albert Ellis version of CBT. Think this right now, and kind of use that to leverage into the contextualistic work. But something like ACT, you just take a leap of faith. I am not changing symptoms. So, really, I'm not doing it. And that, as a therapist, is pretty scary, because that basically will go against everything you've ever been trained in. This is a very different approach. But you can kind of be rest assured that all the research shows it's just as effective, if not more, than the approaches that are targeting symptoms.
But how do you define effective here? Effective meaning that their symptoms do eventually change, or effective just that they're happier?
So from a
happier, obviously not.
So from a contextualistic approach, effective is workability. Are you living the life that you feel you want? So it's very, I don't want to say subjective, but it's going to be in that world more. Whereas with a second wave approach, no, like you want to, effective means they don't feel as depressed. They would be scoring 2s on the Beck assessments. What's also kind of cool about this approach is that it's not like in the other two approaches. We had the behavioral approaches is chucking the psychodynamic folks, and then the next wave is chucking the behavioral folks. But this third wave is actually manifest in all the psychological traditions, whether it's functional analytic psychotherapy with the psychodynamic guys, like the dialectic behavior therapy. It's mostly behavioral therapy, but like I said, it has Ellis aspects of the cognitive approach, and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy would be a pure cognitive approach. Okay, so yeah, the main features of this contextual approach is going to be, again, an emphasis on dialectics. You have that a lot more in DBT, but kind of like if you guys ever did improv, it's yes and. It's the yes and philosophy. You're holding a paradox and you're not wanting to sacrifice one, but figuring out how do you hold both. There's going to be a lot more emphasis on values development. That's going to be the similarity with our friends the existentialists of what does life mean. Here, though, especially in an ACT context, we're leveraging values as a motivation than anything else. It's pure and simple positive reinforcement. What do you want to live for? We're making values like tasty candies, essentially, in the therapeutic work. Every component has mindfulness. But from the more cognitive perspective, mindfulness is used to reduce symptoms. We want to, center ourselves and find our mindful place. There's different mindfulness techniques, whatever. But the goal is to reduce symptoms. Whereas mindfulness and these approaches are used as an exposure therapy. You're moving towards pain. You're being mindful. How does this hurt? And this is really going to, from a behavioral standpoint, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to encourage the person to discriminate their experiences. That their thinking is almost hiking up, this is going to be a level 10 pain, but when they're actually noticing the experience, okay, this is like a 5, this is a 2, maybe this isn't so bad. So they're trying to again, discriminate what their real experience is, as opposed to what the dark side of thinking is pulling them into. There's a huge element of spirituality within these approaches. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about dyadic frames and when I talk about the relational frames themselves. Acceptance, a huge component, and again, from an exposure therapy aspect, not to reduce symptoms, not as a control tactic, but rather, life is pain, period. That's just the way it is. But that there's a difference between pain and suffering, and that would be the primary focus within an ACT model. And it's experiential. It's not didactic at all. Very little. I mean, that's how you can tell the difference between say ACT, right off the bat from other approaches. It's very gestalt in that way. So there's a lot of in session playing around, trying to experience as opposed to talk things out.
Can you give me an example of what that would look like? Trying to experience.
Yeah, well, I'm going to at the end of this close to the end of the slides, I'm going to actually give you videos of ACT techniques. So we're going to really get into that. Okay. So just again, just basic comparison is that the cognitive approach is trying to figure out the relationship between belief and actions, but they're looking at them as very different phenomena, as opposed to this new behavioral approach of RFT and ACT, that they're looking at the human experience as just a complex set of derived relational abilities where we are framing our experiences with verbal cues. In the next slides we're going to get more into this. I know it sounds kind of weird when we're putting it, but that they're trying to operationalize the way you think vis-a-vis yourself, and that's going to be how you think about yourself, your place and time. So all these factors are kind of coalescing in how we describe behavior. So what's really kind of interesting about this approach is, well, this is actually a radical behavioral approach where everything is a behavior. Not just what you do with your hands and legs, but your thoughts are a behavior, your feelings are behavior, and they are governed by the same behavioral principles as your hands and feet are. All right. So I keep mentioning this idea of mechanism and contextualism. What is this stuff? Let's get into that. So there's a really cool book written in 1942. There's a guy named Stephen Pepper. He was a philosopher, and what he was trying to do was he was trying to figure out in a nutshell, why do people argue and not learn from each other? Yeah.
Good question.
And especially in scientific projects. You know, when you really read research with looking at how behavioralists trash the cognitivists and vice versa, man, that thing is brutal. And you really see they're not talking to each other. They really, really aren't. And Stephen Prepper proves it. What he outlines is there are 4 different philosophies of science. That science, we kind of think of, oh, well, you know, science deals with facts, but there's actually underlying assumptions to 4 unique philosophies, how you define truth, how you define what the goal of science should be, how exactly do you define data. These things are up for grabs, and there's no proof, there's no, you know, objective source to figure those questions out. So every science is based on these assumed principles. And today, I want to zero in on the big 2 here. Is going to be mechanism. I'm going to go for the next slide. We're going to deal with mechanism, which is really the CBT model, which is really the psychodynamic model, more or less. It's more formism, but like, if you want to read more about it, you know, Google it. The mechanists, they have, Pepper kind of made, in order to make these ideas easier, he basically said, listen, like all 4 of these have a root metaphor. And the root metaphor of this type of philosophy of science is the machine. That's science in the world, essentially. Everything functions like a machine. That there's an emphasis on parts, and parts make up wholes, but you can take parts out of wholes. Like there's an emphasis on the pieces of things as opposed to the holistic way of viewing something. There is no such thing as a holistic view, according to the mechanistic view. Everything's a bunch of parts, and things affect one another. There's a very strong cause. I mean, everything is governed by cause and effect. And there ultimately is this force that's motivating and pushing forward the cause and effect machine to go. That's the basic summary of the mechanistic model. So, you know, therapies that are, again, are rooted in this model are going to be CBT, or, you know, just cognitive therapy in general, or metacognitive behavior therapy. And you can kind of, you know, you get a feel for them, especially like with when they start talking about cognitive processes. Well, like that's the force. You never actually get a good definition of, well, can you point at it? Like, where is that cognitive process? It's always just this force hanging out in the background. And it's reductionistic. So all this research, again, is parts focused. You're going to be getting to neurobiology and how the neurons do this, and you have the hoo-ha's doing that. The very, very, very specific descriptions of the human body. But what ends up being lost in this approach is its scope. It has low applicability. And that's why there was such a divide, ultimately, between the cognitive psychologists and the clinical cognitive therapists, because it isn't a pragmatic approach at all. It's interesting how we process memory, but how can I use that to actually improve people's lives? Going to the contextualistic approach, their metaphor is ongoing act, an ongoing action in context, an unfolding of behavior. So I got super, super technical on this slide, but essentially the main point I want to get across is you know, all actions are going to, there's no parts to an action. You're looking at a whole. You know, another good metaphor for a contextualistic way of looking at the world is it's like pure statistics. You have variable A and B, and what happens when they come together. There isn't a cause and effect relationship necessarily, if at all. There's no sense of that in this worldview. It's more this idea of, well, when things collide, well, usually something springs out of that, but its reality is made by the meeting of the two different ideas or thoughts. Yeah.
Is this where qualitative studies come in? Is that where that?
It could be. It could be. I mean, a lot of the ACT research is random control trials, you know, because that is the gold standard, and you know they want to not look ridiculous. You know, basically it's a cultural thing. But yeah, it would be more my team to use those.
More my team to use that kind of like interview based.
Yeah. So examples of this work, like I said, would be all these different contextual based approaches, behavior therapy, just in general, behavioral activation, DBT, ACT, and cultural anthropology is in line with this philosophy. Evolutionary psychology is in line with this philosophy. You're basically looking at not so much trying to make a copy of what is real, but you're consistently asking, hey, how's that working for you? What's the outcome ultimately, and what these actions produce? And I mean, you hear that, I mean, that's in all the DBT and ACT manuals, like, that's the question you always ask, you know, how's that working for you? Getting the person and their experience to feel, well, how is the unfolding of their behavior actually feeling? Is it actually achieving the life they want to have?
There's different ways of saying it, by the way. How's that working for you? How's that working?
Yeah, yeah. You do both.
Right,
You would do
exactly.
both, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, definitely,
I mean,
definitely.
the inflection is very important.
You're changing the context of the question. Yeah, that's
why
right.
It's contextual.
That's right. That's right. Okay. So next slide here. So summing all this up, and how is it exactly like fitting into ACT, clinical orientation? So we got a pure behavior therapy approach. The treatment value here is workability. We value, is this useful or not? And the person is very much going to be involved in how you define that. We do not, in terms of diagnosis, it's not mechanistic. You know, we're very much rejecting a reductionistic way of looking at the human being. It's not medically oriented unless it's useful. What's really cool about this philosophy of science is, out of all of them, as mentioned before, you know, like when you get in debates with people, like a mechanist is just going to look at the world differently than a contextualist. Well, if a contextualist's primary value of truth is being effective, well, it's not so effective to talk to a mechanist like a contextualist. So you're always, it's the one philosophy of science you can actually become a chameleon in and piggyback on the other ones if it's going to achieve your goals, ultimately in this case of having the person have a more satisfying life. Okay. As far as the diagnostic tool, so it's not as though we're chucking the DSM, although we're kind of chucking the DSM. ACT is going to be using a functional analysis to assess the problems in a person's life. Here I have an example of, in DBT, they use a chain analysis, where basically it's like a functional analysis on steroids, where what you're doing is you're looking at whole behaviors, you know, identifying, well, what was the problem going on, you know, I started yelling at my wife would be the problem event, and you're going backwards in time outlining all the antecedents. What happened the past 2 hours that led up to that problem event? And you're making these little chains of action that led you there. And within each chain, you're trying to assess, well, what were you thinking, what were you feeling, what was your body doing? And so within each chain, you have a new sort of chain of figuring out, well, what order do thoughts, feelings, and behaviors unfold? Is it you're behaving in a certain way and this triggers thoughts? Or are you feeling a certain way and this motivates you to just want to punch a hole in the wall? So you're really having running two diagnostics, one on top of the other, to figure out, well, what's the problem here?
Is there any discussion about what happens when the client has trouble identifying what their emotions are or how their body feels?
Well, I mean, that's going to be one outcome. As soon as you see that's going on, you're going to have to work on a mindfulness to develop that. That would be one problem that you'd be diagnosing using this tool.
So you go backwards and start doing that stuff first before you go into the next.
Or if that would be effective. A lot of times maybe it wouldn't be. So what's cool about using a functional analysis is you have a whole roadmap of what the problems are. And within each chain, it's almost like you can kind of imagine, within each chain you can fit in a solution. And so you're simultaneously creating your treatment plan when you do a functional analysis. And kind of figuring out, well, what gets you more money with this client, you know? And there's been a lot of really cool research recently about client factors, where, you know, say someone comes in with depression, but they're have a much better developed vocabulary, they're a lot more cognitive. Well, use a more cognitive approach with them. That's a strength they have, you know, maximize that. Or if someone, you know, maybe more low IQ and is more a doing person, let's say, you know, the two are not mutually, you know, they're not the same thing, but you would want to go in that direction and try and maximize gains by using more of a behavioralist technique. Again, contextualistic. What can you get out of the client using the skills he already has? So you can really assess that using this sort of thing also.
Yep, you know, so
Yeah.
can I just wanna, cause like, I'm struggling with what you just said, cause a lot of times people come in with depression or some,
Yeah.
you know, anxiety, and they're very cognitive, and part of the problem is their thinking.
Yeah, that's that
So-
is exactly the problem. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
so what you're saying is well, if they come in cognitive, you know, and go with that, then basically you're basically multiplying, I don't know the right word, but using a thing that's getting them in trouble instead of trying to develop the other part where
Yeah.
they may be able to be mindful and,
Yes.
and hold on to different feelings that are, you know, that are going on simultaneously within themselves.
Yeah.
So, because you said, we'll go with that, but see, to me, that's sort of a contradiction, because a lot of times, somebody that's running around, that's behavioral, that's running around, he doesn't really have a whole lot of cognitive stuff. You have to work on the cognitive. That's where they're weak, so how do you understand that? 'Cause it's-
Well, I mean, and that would kind of be, I think, an overlapping of two different phenomena, like we all think. And like what you're describing, that is the dark side of language, how, and this is really what what RFT and ACT are really driving at, is we bring our past and future and have that, we just shove that into the present. And it alters the way we think. And by altering the way we think, that alters the environment we live in. That's the dark side of language. You can't escape that ever. I'm more focusing on people who are more, you know, maybe a better way of putting it is verbally dynamic, that they have a strength in being able to define their experiences as opposed to it just kind of eating them inside.
So it's different.
It is different, yes, it is different, 100% different, 100% different. Alright. Okay, in terms of like tracking progress, generally ACT therapists stay away from using classic clinical questionnaires. I just like throwing a lot of tests at people. But a classic assessment as you're going through treatment would be the life enhancement exercise report form. And basically what you're looking at, because within the ACT model, your target, what you don't want to have is suffering and struggle. That's very subjective. And you're wanting to work towards workability and valued action. Those are the things you want to increase. And so with this client here, you kind of see like in the yellow and the gray, that just skyrocketed up, and the orange and blue, you're able to get those separated. You're basically trying to separate these two ways of being. You don't want these to overlap. This is in an ACT way of thinking of things, is you're trying to peel out. It's almost like taking gum out of your hair. You want to be experiencing the moment as it is, and you're trying to peel the gum out of all the things that being verbal creatures puts in the moment that really don't belong there. They're not inherent in the moment, and so you're pulling these things apart. This client happened to, I ran different assessments on it, on him, and he was suffering from borderline personality disorder. So like his scores were just off the wall. But within a year's time, we were able to reduce, in terms of like SCL, like, you know, most of the things he was having clinical scores, he was able to reduce 3 of those, and the rest were halved, only using a pure ACT model. So again, this is showing that dramatic problems don't have to be treated focusing on content, and like, man, borderline is very content, you know, there's a lot of suffering there. But even with such a dramatic problem, taking the risk and having the courage to say, you know what, let's try and hold this differently as opposed to getting rid of problems, actually got rid of problems. Okay. So what's RFT? What's this whole thing about? So RFT, Relational Frame Theory, is really, like I said, describing how we develop language. How do we learn how to speak and think? And what was really cool about what happened with this research, I forget the guy's name, it was Seligman, who was doing this research on kids with autism. And he was using a pure ABA approach, teaching kids how to identify pictures and words and read. And the way you kind of do it is, well, you kind of present the written word apple, and you're wanting the kid to point at the picture of an apple, and that's basically what you're doing, training these kids for 6 hours a day for, 2 years. And the classic model was, well, then you're going to have to actually go back and teach, okay, when you show this picture of an apple, you're going to have to create associations with the word apple. So that's pretty time consuming. What he stumbled on was that people have this ability to derive relationships between things that have no link, that you never had to train or teach them the link. They actually manifest it in the way that their human brain works. So they're teaching ducky, 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 word ducky to the actual animal, and then just by accident these kids started to do the opposite without any previous training. It's like, huh, that's interesting. So this was relational frame theory being born. Okay. So we're looking at language as a learned behavior, and it's going to influence context. That it's actually language, we kind of think about it this way, is that when we speak, we're throwing things out into our environment. And our environment is what is influencing our behavior. So when we identify or think about things, we're changing what that object is in our environment. And it's going to be that object plus whatever we think or say about it is going to be coming barreling right back at us to change the way that we experience life. It's this sort of relational framing is again, this is a behavioral, it's a generalized operant that we just learn over time through a reinforcement history. Just the more that people talk to us, the more we just kind of get it. The main thing to get out of this slide, I think, is just how symbolic language is. Within relational frame theory, there's this sort of balance between, well, what are the non-arbitrary aspects of an object? This is green, it is tall, it is narrow. And again, trying to get the gum out of the hair, because as I would speak about this bottle, well, I could put a lot of history and a lot of feelings in this thing. It no longer is a narrow plastic object, but something that has, a lot of happy memories associated with it. But I'm putting that into the object by the way that I'm orienting myself to it. So there's four key terms, four key ideas to kind of keep in your pocket when looking at RFT. One's called mutual entailment, one's combinatorial entailment, transformation of function is the third, and rule-governed behavior is the fourth. And all these things, all these phenomena are what RFT is attempting to describe. So mutual entailment is kind of what I already showed you guys, is mutual entailment is what enables us to create symbolic relationships between things or events or objects, and that is bidirectional. It's the ducky that I gave over to you guys, and that you can make those connections without any previous learning. And that mutual entailment its base is going to be more the non-arbitrary aspects of things. We're looking at size, color, and shape. Those are things that are inherent within the object. And within mutual entailment, even though these two objects are different, the kitty cat and the dog, I see how they're exactly alike in terms of size, color, and shape. Shape not, but color and size, yes.
Wait, but I'm only able to go back and forth between these two objects because I've gone back and forth in other situations. If I've not learned the skill of going back and forth between two ideas, I'm not necessarily going to get that.
It's not so much a skill, you automatically do it. That was what came out of the research, is you don't have to learn that so much. It's developed through exemplar training, but it happens automatically. That's actually what makes you different than animals. Animals can't do this. They can't do mutual entailment at all. As smart as Coco the gorilla is, she ain't talking in as far as how RFT defines speech. This ability to create these symbolic relationships without prior learning. She can't do it. Okay. The next. Yeah, here we go. So, and again, just another graph of showing how mutual entailment, that we can make associations between, and they can be non-arbitrary associations between a red cross and triangle, and then we can do the same thing with triangle to square, and that we don't have to learn them both ways. We can just learn them one way, and the whole thing automatically unfolds. With the next slide, in combinatorial entailment, this gets cool. Because as soon as I've created associations between my red triangle and my red cross and my triangle, and then I create associations between my triangle and my square, I now automatically, without any learning, make connections between the red cross and the green square without any learning either way.
Just do it.
You just do it.
Yeah.
So, an example of this could be, that once you learn that the word silah in Spanish means kisei in Hebrew, well, guess what? You can automatically, without me having to tell you, silah means chair in English. You just know it, and you do it automatically. And we take this for granted. It's like, well, what I'm telling you is quite straightforward. This is our human experience, but it's like only humans do this. And this is exactly what enables language to develop so quickly, in the time span of 3 years from being born. RFT outlines different frames. The way they look at it is these are kind of like different stimuli. They're kind of cues that will link objects or events or thoughts or feelings together. And I just ran through a couple basic ones. We have frames of coordination. X is Y. So for example, when I tell you that a dog is a wolf, even though they're really not, but let's pretend they are. If a dog is a wolf, and then I tell you wolves are dangerous, what do you know about dogs?
Dangerous.
Dangerous. You never had to experience a dog ever. They're dangerous. Opposition, X is not negative. There are opposites in the world. And these two relational frames are really, really, really easy to train in say, kids with autism, or in general as you're growing up. These are the first relational frames you get as a human being. The next three are much more difficult to train in, being able to make distinctions and comparisons, and then creating hierarchies. And a lot of that work is really the therapeutic work in a more advanced way. And I'm not saying that you don't have coordination, because brass tacks, one manifestation of this is, all places are places, and if I have a panic attack in this place, I will have a panic attack in every place. That's how things, disorders kind of spread almost in a person's life.
We call that generalization.
That's exactly what it is. Well, it's not so much generalization as equating.
Equating.
Yeah. Or making comparisons. Exactly right. As far as the hierarchies go, what are really cool about them is, that you use hierarchies to group objects. You're simplifying a person's world. Well, within clinical work, in order to leverage your work with a client, you can start making hierarchies of value. What drives your life? What makes life meaningful? By having overarching values, being a great dad, and outlining different goals that exist in that value. What are actionable things that make you a great dad? Again, trying to.
I keep going forward. Should I switch?
That's okay. Yeah, go ahead. Go for it. Okay. Diegetic frames are kind of cool. I thought I'd touch on them a little bit because they're our fundamental experience of consciousness, and they center around three different concepts: I, you, here, there, now, then. It's not so much abstracting objects, like, for example, a wolf is a dog. That you're abstracting an object and creating comparisons between two physical things. Whereas here, what you're doing is you're actually making abstractions in the speaker, leading into empathy. That in terms of developing empathy, what comes out of the research here is, classically we kind of think of empathy as trying to put yourself in another person's shoes. Well, that's only one half of these three frames of I, you, here, there, then. You actually have to simultaneously develop both. You can't have empathy without developing who you are in your own awareness. They happen simultaneously. And it's the I, here, now experience which is ultimately consciousness. From a RFT perspective, you are always here, you are always now, and here now are constantly changing, and that's that movement through time of always being here and now, and hopefully you are yourself, is this unbounded sense of consciousness, this having no limits in how you experience your most basic being. All that is I, here, now, moving through time. And that's again how RFT would conceptualize that. Transformational function. So So we've been very much touching on this idea with mutual entailment that, you know, as soon as you associate, say, this purple triangle with shock, and you make associations with that between, say, your green square or your cross, well, you're going to automatically have fear to these other things which absolutely do not look like a purple triangle. And so it gets even more hairy because, well, you're using these relational frames of comparison. Let's say, you know, if you have a panic attack, electric shock, you have a panic attack in a little McCullough. Well, the way that you relationally frame the place as being small and not so many people, you will automatically, without ever experiencing it, be dead certain you're going to have a panic attack in Macy's.
Yeah.
Huge place, lots of people.
Yeah.
And again, you've never had that experience ever. So what's language? So language is a learned behavior of building and responding to symbolic relations. They're the same thing, language and cognition, high and hot. And what we're trying to do in therapy is we're trying to leverage the ability to change the symbolic meaning of a thought, trying to put it in a new frame. I mean, the idea of relational frames is a metaphor. A picture changes with the type of frame you give it. You know, you can take a work of art like a Mona Lisa and put on a Donald Duck frame. That's something you hang up in a dorm room. You don't put that in a museum. The frames themselves aren't so much changing the non-arbitrary aspects of what's going on, but they really do because its context is so different. Okay. I'm just kind of looking at this picture. I think it's a cool diagram when you start thinking about work trying to get rid of thoughts and feelings. Again, a CBT approach. Every thought and feeling is a web. You really can't get rid of thoughts and feelings because they're anchored by thousands of thoughts and feelings. The best you can do is extinction. You can reduce the likelihood it manifests itself, but you can never unlearn anything. So from a clinical, taking this idea in a clinical approach, you would never even want to attempt to get rid of it. You'd want to add to human experience and almost water down what a person experiences. It's like a very salty soup. How do you fix it? You can't get the salt out. What you do is just add more water.
Or potatoes.
Or potatoes. That works too.
Could work. Yeah,
Okay.
very salty potatoes. Okay.
Okay. So there's two ways to change. Content and context. This would be a CBT approach, looking at trying to make concrete changes in a person's life. You're in a prison. So what do? How do you get out of prison? Well, you make a little dummy, hide them in the bed, and they have this little hole underneath the sink, and that's how you escape. You pull an Andy Dufresne, and you get out of there. That's how you solve that problem. Or you do it symbolically, like Nelson Mandela did. The act of him being in prison was the same thing as freeing an entire nation. Those are two very different ways of escaping prison. Okay. There's another way of looking at the playing field here. Again, a CBT approach. You're assessing antecedents, beliefs, and consequences, and again, very much into the symptoms, into the content. Whereas from an ACT approach on the other side here, you're not touching the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences so much, really. I mean, you'll play around with them, but not in the sense to change them, but you're changing everything that surrounds them. So it would kind of be the difference, say, of you're eating too much. So how do you solve the problem? Well, the CBTers would try and make you think differently towards food. I really shouldn't do it. It's not a good thing for me to do. You know, I need to really keep myself in check. From an ACT approach, just use a smaller plate.
Mm-hmm.
And then I go back twice.
Yeah. Then you go back twice. Yeah.
You're still trying to change how much they're
You hop in some exercise.
You're still trying to change how much they're eating. I mean, using the smaller plate is still with the goal of
Yeah.
eating less.
I'm definitely using it as a metaphor of like what your target would be, because you're not trying to change the way they think about eating at all. You're not trying to change the way how they feel about eating at all. Just do something different. The axiom in ACT and these sort of approaches is really like, and you get this in the functional analysis, is you look at what the person's doing and you're like, okay, whatever you're doing, if we do something different, it will for sure be better. The solution-based therapies, took this on. It's like, if your husband and wife are having a fight, great, keep fighting, we're not going to work on that.
Well, let's go to the beach.
But every time you fight, go into the bathroom. or one person stands on their head. It is very hard to carry on a fight if you're standing on your head. And these are actual interventions they suggested, and they are effective because they're targeting the context. Okay. Rule govern behavior.
I mean, the research goes on to show that the fighting between the couples decreases in frequency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the type of fight becomes less intense because it is kind of comical you standing on your head, or be inventive, come up with all sorts of things, yeah. Or even something as addictions, they've seen a fair outcome of, like, every time you want to smoke, we'll put underwear on your head. Silly. Very silly. Like, what's the connection between that? There's no intuitive context of, like, well, me putting underwear on my head, why would I smoke less? Well, you're changing the context.
And people in the...
It's not the best approach, but it's an approach. I don't want to confuse
Yeah,
them.
but with addictions, the chances that people are going to follow any rules other than their own are really limited.
Yeah, that's what was coming to my mind as I think about a couple in a fight.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a second. What I should do now, instead of yelling about this situation,
Stand to my head.
Instead of smoking this joint that I just...
Well, no, let me catch you right there. No,
smoking.
please don't. Please smoke it. Go for it. Don't stop fighting. Keep doing that. That's okay. Just before you do, put underwear on you.
Right, but if I'm going to put underwear on my head, I might as well just take a walk outside, use a Gottman's 20-minute timeout, because now I'm thinking cognitively, and I can just do something healthy.
And that is more effective. That's changing context. You simply remove yourself from the
right.
situation.
Same idea.
That is changing context.
Because he's out of the place. It's all about
100%.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is the research actually found that people were able to stop the addictive behavior they were so emotionally engaged in and do something healthier.
Yeah, but it's not, and I wouldn't say that's like a gold standard treatment, but it is effective. It does have an effect size. It's not by chance, that's my point.
Just the 12-step programs work. They tell people when you feel like using, make a phone call.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
It's
just making it change, yeah.
Then don't some people claim that you haven't really changed the person?
Well,
Meaning,
I
when
think
put back in that
that's-
context, they'll do it again. So then,
Cognitives do.
But it doesn't
Contextualists would say, "You joking me?
Yeah.
Of course you did." Different philosophy of science. I can't talk to that person. He can't talk to me. We fundamentally have a different view of what does it mean to change. So, yeah. Okay.
But long-term studies on ACT versus CBT, like, let's say 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, are there any studies that...
Yes, and they're amazing. Yeah.
Right, because as far as I understand it, when you're changing somebody's values and you're helping them, like, get into who they are as a person, they're just not that person anymore.
Yeah. I mean, even now, like, the more meta-analyses they've been doing, just because, ACT has, about, like, what, 40 years behind research with CBT, so they have a little bit of catching up to with data collection. But now the most recent meta-analyses show that ACT is more effective.
Of course.
Yeah. So, but still, research is developing. Okay, I think this is a kind of a cool thing to keep in mind. What language affects the rules that we create for ourselves? And so, me kind of simplifying this, there's really two types of rules we create for ourselves. One's based on tracking, our lived experience.
This is very important.
And the other is pliance, where I have a rule, this is going to work, and without any actual experience of that rule, I go forth and I follow out the rule. Now, only people do this. Only people have rule-governed behavior. Animals don't. Animals are always tracking, meaning it's basic behavioral principles of antecedent behavior and consequence. And we kind of stumbled on this one because when we were doing research on behaviors of people, well, we kind of behave the same way as animals. Like, there really are, in the environment, we can kind of orient ourselves in a way of looking at human action from a contingency management perspective, but it's always funky. The data is always, like, very different or very, very different. It's there, we do interact with our environment, but it's like something else is going on with people. And that other thing is, by the way that our language changes our environment, taking a rule and putting it in the world, we've changed the world to be that rule. No matter if it works or not, I'm going to no longer be sensitive to me being unsuccessful. So they had a really, really funny research project on this, where what they did, they had two different groups of people come in, and their job was they're going to press a space bar. Whenever they see a green triangle, they press a space bar, they get money. Group A was told the rule. Group B, and it was in the corner, you could see how much money you're making, and that was great. So you have a nice incentive to keep pushing that space bar. Group B was not provided any rule. They kind of had to catch on, oh, whenever a green triangle pops up, I'm going to get money. That's great. So being psychologists researchers, they're sadistic. In the middle of the run, they change the rules. All of a sudden, the rule ceased to be whenever you see a green triangle, you'll get money. Well, Group A didn't catch on. They had the rule. This is going to work. This is going to work. This is going to work. They changed their environment with their verbal rule.
They didn't have Rosh Gadol.
Oh yeah. Group B, they cashed in. I think they made like 3 times more money. Like there was a huge
Rosh
lag.
Gadol.
A huge lag. And that it's this idea of pliance, as opposed to tracking, this idea of rule-governed behavior that is able to describe human behavior and give us a way better level of prediction of human behavior. Okay. So what does all of this mean clinically? Because these are a lot of really cool ideas. But what's the outcome of all this? Okay. Taking into account all this data, this is how ACT describes, and how RFT describes the development of human suffering. So we're all biologically oriented to avoid pain. We don't like it. We are avoidance machines always. And in the external environment, that works out great. If you're cold, you get a coat. If it's raining, build a house. It's actually, we've been conditioned to avoid pain because in the external environment, that really, really, really works. That's a rule-governed behavior. Avoid pain, you will cease feeling it. So once you have that rule-governed behavior, you're no longer going to be sensitive to whether or not you're reducing pain. Now, in the external world, it doesn't matter because it always works in the external world. What happens when we apply this rule to the internal world? Because we're going to. Because based on mutual entailment, I automatically am going to associate the external world to the internal world. That's a relational frame of coordination, just like that. And I am not going to be sensitive to the results of my internal world because of that rule-governed behavior I established in the external world. The whole thing carries over. Well, unfortunately, feelings and thoughts cannot be fixed. They're not under conscious control. You can't make a thought go away. You can't make a feeling go away. You can make the cold go away by turning up the heat. But the more you try not to think about a pink elephant, you will think about a pink elephant. It just does. The rules are not the same. And even worse, you get hit with what's called the boomerang effect. The more that you try thought or feeling suppression, that'll work as a great short-term goal, avoidance, but it's going to hit you back 10 times as hard a little bit later.
It's like what you resist persists.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So these things are only going to get worse. You can't avoid them. They're going to always be there. And you're not going to get rid of them because, like I kind of pointed out in a couple slides back, is that the associations are a web. Every idea and thought you've ever had is anchored by every other thought and feeling you've ever had. You don't just get rid of them. I mean, it's kind of like, almost the best you can do is learn more effective behavior. And that's it, you only add. And it's even kind of tragic when I think about it, in this way, when you think about, say September 11th, all the ways those people tried to escape. They went through every learned behavior they ever had. They know how to walk and run down those stairs, they know how elevators work, they press the button. They went through that chain. Every single one of them used the very last solution they ever learned in the beginning of their life was they cried for their mothers. You don't unlearn that. It's just, you learn more effective ways of dealing with the world. You never have to cry for mom. The way I get out of bed every morning is, I just get out of bed. I know how to sit up. I don't have to cry for my wife to come help me out of bed. It's not...
That's good.
Yes, that's good.
Thanks for sharing.
That's good.
What about your mom?
Yeah, we're getting Freudian.
Good catch, you didn't say that.
We're getting Freudian, watch out.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's these relational frames that are actually increasing suffering. We're losing contact with what's literally going on in front of us. We're piling all of our life experiences in this present moment, whether it makes sense or not. Our minds just do it. And this increases suffering. Next slide. So what do we do? So like I said, it's impossible to unlearn. We can only rely on extinction. So from an ACT perspective, like I said, we're only adding, not subtracting. Within an ACT perspective, we're heavily using metaphoric language. What we're basically doing is we're accepting, man, there's a dark side to language. Language is what's causing suffering. Let's try and use it in a novel way. Try and use expressions or ways of speaking that the person has never, ever, ever heard. So it's almost like you're giving them the opportunity to have a fresh experience by speaking in ways they never had. So you could really, if you want to get really into this, there's Barnes Holmes. She's a developer of RFT and the autistic work, but she has really great stuff on how to create metaphors clinically. So you're checking her out; it'd be really cool. So you're using a lot of metaphors in your language. You're never asking why, like really never asking why. What's interesting about whys is what it'll end up leading you towards is rule-governed behavior. So whenever you're asked, well, why are you doing that? They're just going to tell you their rule. But the rule they have is what's causing their suffering. You want to stay away from that as possible. You want to extinguish that behavior of following the rule. That's number one. Number two is if you ever look at, there's really cool research on the split brain research that came out. I think it was in the 70s they were doing this, where people who were suffering from epilepsy, what they ended up having to do is they cut the hemispheres, and what ended up happening is they realized that there's more than one consciousness going on up there, and that most of the reasons you generate are actually post hoc. The way they figured this out is, well, because your hemispheres are split and the left hemisphere is more verbal, by a lot more verbal, the right not so much, what they would do is they would kind of put dividers in both eyeballs. The left side of every eye goes to the right hemisphere, the right side goes to the left. So they put these dividers, and in the left side, which is going to the right, the nonverbal hemisphere, they were giving the participants directions. Go get direction, go get a Coke, direction, call your wife. So the person would do it. Because he's reading the thing, he's following directions. But because it's going to the nonverbal part of his brain, he doesn't realize he's actually following directions. So he gets up, he walks out of the room, and the researcher asks, well, what are you doing? Oh, I'm thirsty, I need a Coke. Huh. Oh, what are you doing? Oh, my wife, my wife wants me to call her. I want to give her a call. That's not why they were doing it. They were told to do it by the researcher. They created the reason post hoc. So whenever you're asking why, unless being good contextualists, if it's effective, great. But man, know what trouble you're getting into when you ask that. You're probably creating more relational frames that will cause you problems than anything else.
With Israelis who ask lama all the time.
Yeah.
It's a little different.
Yeah.
Lena, what did you say?
Israelis use lama all the time, and it doesn't have the same weight as why does to English speakers. And it's like interesting. So you kind of, with them, they throw it much more in their language.
And what that could be, it's interesting because with all this new research on context-focused treatments, they're starting to go back and look at, how does CBT really work? I mean, is it really that different? What's coming out is that it might actually be what makes CBT work is not the fact it's focusing on content, but more you're encouraging people to play with ideas, that our ideas are something you play with, which is very Jewish.
Yes.
So it's sort of back to the NLP stuff.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
You're tuning out and you're tuning in and you're making clearer.
Yeah.
Right, that's true. When she came and talked to us about NLP, that's true.
Yeah.
That is true.
Like rewind.
Havita Syringe when she came and talked to us
So yeah,
about
very much.
NLP.
It's very similar. It's like their thoughts are things you play with. They're not realities. Yeah.
And memories are things you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. So, what do we do? 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 Yeah. Fine. So what in ACT we're trying to do is we're trying to use the transformation of function to our benefit.
Right.
Or weaponizing that
So
sucker.
opportunity.
By focusing, and there's 6 processes that ACT uses to do that. One is values work, where what you're doing is you're trying to use different relational frames in relation to these stated problems, that it's no longer that problems are bogging you down, but you're now introducing values work in such a way where that motivates change, number one, but number two, you're almost like, when people have problems, it's like they're trying to wait for the problems to go away before they actually start living.
Right.
And from an ACT perspective, well, we can keep those problems, let's just keep living. And values work is a way of carrying your problems in a fulfilled life. That changes what those problems feel like. Using values work and more broadly trying to focus on different types of relational frames. When you're using a functional analysis, what you're kind of thinking is, how does this person think? He's making these sorts of comparisons, he's using these sorts of frames that are framing his life in a very specific way. Well, you get those on a list, and what you're basically trying to do is put those on an extinction plan. Use other frames of hierarchy, that would be values, or frames of distinction. How are these things different? Instead of the frames that are causing the problems, which is going to be usually something like frames of comparison. This is like the horrible life I had with my mom. This is like the horrible time I had in the war. That's really a lot of problems are just equating things, bringing them into the present. So you're putting those on extinction plans. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is, well, now that we have this value work going, well, we're going to want to have that manifest in committed action. That's going to be more classically what we would associate as therapy. Every behavioral technique that exists can be incorporated in ACT. It's worth noting that, given, when we're talking about practical interventions, you have to be very careful because ACT has to be a standalone intervention, meaning you can't start mixing content-driven therapy. You have to choose one, basically. If a client comes in, you assess what's going on. You can use both. All therapy is effective, like I mentioned before, but if you commit to ACT, you have to stay in ACT, because otherwise you're just going to thwart all the work you've done. You're giving two opposite messages: run away from pain and don't run away from pain. So you really, within drafting what you actually do, you have to bear that one in mind. So you can draw from other approaches, like, for example, I really like, RODBT. They focus heavily on using your physiology to reduce anxiety. Eyebrows open, lean back, arms out. Your body sends you the message things are fine. Well, that's not an ACT approach. You're changing the content. Mm-hmm. So, but using the processes of ACT, you can kind of look at that and say, hey, wait a second. Making that an ACT intervention, you can kind of bring to the client's experience of, look how fragile your feelings are. All you had to do is change your eyebrows. What is that? What do you think that might say about what's going on in the moment? So you can edit non-ACT interventions to become ACT interventions as long as you're following this map. Yeah.
So it's sort of like narrative where you can basically use it as a stance, whether you're doing exactly that or not. You can use the ACT stance.
Yeah, similar. Yeah. Okay. What you're trying to, another part of this is you're trying to, again, get the person in the present moment using mindfulness, but mindfulness as an exposure therapy. We're not trying to calm the person down. We're actually trying to broaden their experience of what does it feel like to be in excruciating pain. Now again, there's a little bit of a leap of faith here. You don't want to hurt the client, and obviously you have to be sensitive to that. But what is ultimately happening in these sort of challenging life situations is the person's wanting to avoid that pain. The relational cues are magnifying the suffering. So the more that you can get the person in the present moment and actually feel maybe this isn't as bad as you think it is, that again creates the opportunity for change. The last two, diffusion and self as context, these two processes are used to try and pull back the curtain from the Wizard of Oz. Yeah, it's a nice metaphor that everyone thinks the Wizard of Oz is this big, scary magician, but really it's not. It's just some weird guy who got lost and knows how to use a microphone. It's pulling apart these two ideas. Again, the gum and the hair idea. There's what your actual present moment experience is literally, and then there's all this other stuff you're putting into it using you're using your magic mind to help you get into that suffering. And then there's self as context, and this is a really interesting one. This is as far as you get into trying to reduce suffering. Self as context is this sort of observer self, where you've experienced your entire life behind these eyes, and you've seen it all, and you've experienced it all. And that observer, he hasn't died, he hasn't been harmed, he hasn't changed. It's the same you that's experiencing now is the you that was there 10 years ago and the same you that was there 20 years ago. There's a part of you that, the metaphor in ACT that's used is this chessboard, where all the suffering in life and all the bad ideas are the black pieces, and then all the good you want in your life are the white pieces, and there's this huge war going on. Well, the observer self, in this metaphor, who are you? You're the actual board. In a game of chess, the board's not harmed. The board never goes away. Pieces come and go. Pieces are fighting and they affect each other, but the board always stays the same. So it's kind of creating a safe haven for a person to be able to get in the present moment, to observe what's going on in this more detached sort of way. Now so I think with the next slide will kind of really bring this point home, is here's all 6 processes and they're all interrelated. This is not a protocol. ACT is not a set of fancy metaphors or techniques, although they exist as, say, more like guideposts in how to become a good ACT therapist. But what you're doing is throughout any given session, you might be dancing between every single one of these 6 processes.
They told us we danced around the hexaplex.
Dance around the hexaplex, that's right. It's easy to see how, well, if you're motivated by your values to do something, you're going to end up doing something, committed action. If you have a fair sense of self as context, this untouchable self who observes everything, well, now you start looking at thoughts differently. You land into cognitive diffusion. Acceptance is a really great way of leading into the present moment, and vice versa. So in that sense, it's incredibly dynamic as a therapy. Okay. Summing a lot of this up, the idea of suffering and pain. See, ACT promises pain. Life is pain.
Life is pain and
Life
pain
is pain, period. Strassel, he was one of the 3 developers of ACT. He used to be a DBT guy. And so he did a lot of research in suicide. And so he was one of the, a lot of his research has gone to show, 50% of people seriously think of killing themselves.
Yeah, pain is part of life.
That's not a weird disorder. That's the human condition. 10% do it, 20% have an actual plan, and another 20% are seriously thinking about it. There's nothing wrong with you necessarily. That's kind of life. So it's a whole reorientation of this medical model. It is not a medical model. And so ACT delineates between pain, which, man, life is pain, and suffering. All the things that we do with our learning history and the dark side of language and all the rule-governed behavior that trips us up, that increases suffering. That's what we're trying to, if anything, that's what we're trying to reduce, but never reduce pain. And when you put things this way to clients, you do 2 things. Number 1 is you're automatically trustworthy because you're not selling them a bridge. Number 1, and number 2, you're not standing over the client as the expert, although you are. But it's a great model because it enhances the ability to connect with the client because, man, this is the story of life. This is what I, as a therapist, am doing. It is only by the grace of God that the roles were not reversed and that I'm not in your chair and you're not in my chair. Yeah. This is what we all go through. So it's a very powerful reframe in being able to go on the life journey with your client to a different place, to a different way of living. Okay. Fine. So what we're gonna go through is the 6 different processes in ACT that I listed off. I have a cool video here for each one that we're going to look at.
This is Steve.
What we're seeing here is with the initial stages of ACT, like I said, is a functional analysis. But because this is ACT, we're not going to do a classic functional analysis of like making this boring, weird sort of graph and figure it all out like they kind of do in DBT.
Yes.
We have to couch this in metaphor. So what you end up doing in the first couple sessions, it's called creative hopelessness. It's a great name. Where basically what you're doing is you're inviting the client to bring in your life, and you're literally putting on the table every single solution he's ever done in his life to try and kick this problem. So what's great is you're using functional analysis to figure out, well, this is what doesn't work, number one. Number two, everything on this list is going to be short-term solutions generally. They're all going to be avoidance behavior. Within ACT, again, we're not using DSM ways of looking at the world.
He's against the DSM. He says the DSM is going out like a ship. And a new wave is coming in.
Check out the white papers. When the DSM-5 came out, what they had, it was white papers. It was like a 100-page document assessing basically how the DSM is a complete failure, that they were never able to find any sort of comparison whatsoever to the medical model, but then to keep it. So it's kind of hilarious reading this thing. You're almost like, wait a second, this is the introduction to the DSM? It's like, hi guys, we failed. Here's our book. So it's very much rejecting what's cool and usable about this technique is reducing every single symptom to basically experiential avoidance as being the problem. That's the diagnosis. A person comes into your room, it is always experiential avoidance, period. And you always know what the solution is. Increasing psychological flexibility, which is these 6 processes that I outlined. So with creative helplessness, once you have everything on the table, you transitioned into the blind man with a shovel metaphor, which is really the story of suffering. This is the story of life, that we're almost as if we're all blind. The person is, I don't know how you got there. We don't know why, because we don't ask why in ACT. You're just wandering in this field full of holes, and you're blindfolded, and someone gave you a little bag,
like that.
and eventually just fall into one of these holes. In each hole, maybe you can kind of crawl out of one, and they're different depth, different widths. You trip around through life, and fine, fair enough. But then you'll end up falling into one hole that you just can't get out of. So you're stuck. So what do? Well, hey, I got this bag. Let's see what's inside. And lo and behold, there's a shovel. You start digging in the hole, digging in the hole, digging in the hole. And you're not really going anywhere. You're just piling dirt on yourself. You try and whittle away stairs with the shovel. That doesn't work. You're just making a mess. And along comes somebody. Again, you're blindfolded. Along comes somebody, says, "Hey man, here, take this." He hands you a ladder. And what do? Start digging with the ladder. That's the metaphor you present. Now listen, all these things on the table we put here, none of these have worked. Your experience tells you they haven't worked. You're going into tracking, targeting rule-governed behavior, trying to fight the pliance here. We know these things don't work. And man, you're coming in here and you even, you're hoping to get therapy, and if you need therapy, you want to try and get rid of these things, that's one way of doing it, but maybe that's a shovel. Maybe I'm just a golden shovel as a therapist. You're making me a golden shovel. Maybe if you use me as a shovel, this isn't going to work. Maybe we're going to have to try something different. So you're getting the person rooted in his lived experience. You're outlining that his entire life has been content-driven. Solve the problem, solve the problem, solve the problem. Well, that's just more digging. And what they need to do is do something different, change their context. Get out of this hole. Transcend the hole.
You have 20 minutes.
I got 20 minutes. Okay, we'll do good. Okay, so this footage is picking up off finishing that metaphor, and this is Stephen Hayes, who's the developer of ACT, is
we have his
laying
book here
out this treatment plan for his client. So go ahead.
So the bald guy in the white suit
He's
is
Stephen Hayes.
Stephen Hayes.
Oh, back one.
I'll tell you, we've only got one ally in here that's really powerful. Here's our ally. It's your pain. Is this the life that you want to be living?
No.
Okay. Do you need any more experience with that part of it? Or have you had enough? Is this enough? Have you suffered enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Because this is scary. The only thing that would embolden you to do that is you have had enough. And if you haven't, I'll try to get you a good referral. I'll try to get some other folks who say they can help you dig your way out, but I don't see it.
It's a lot of like 12-step stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're saying is just like your thing, powerlessness, bottom, hitting a place where a person wants to change.
Yeah.
First step.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Admitting you're powerless and letting a force higher than yourself help you out.
Spirituality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
They talk a lot about that.
Which actually goes back to Jung.
Yeah, they talk a lot about
Hooray
that.
for Young.
I love you. All right, so acceptance, the opposite being experiential avoidance. Now, the tricky thing with doing act work is after the first several sessions, your client's going to start talking like he's accepting, but really he's avoiding. Really, he's using acceptance as a control tool to get out of his pain. He's using it like a shovel. So as you're going through, you have to have a real sensitivity of, is he really holding pain, or is he using acceptance? With acceptance work, there's a lot of guided imagery. There's a lot, again, this is a type of exposure to the thoughts and feelings that are troubling the person. So you have a lot of different exercises, like mindfully experiencing, accepting the thoughts as though they're clouds in the sky, floating, and they just dissipate. You allow them to dissipate on their own as opposed to forcing them to do so. And again, a lot of acceptance will be mindfulness. Again, this is a process-based intervention, so there's a lot of overlap. Or, the soldiers on a parade, every single thought is a soldier just marching on down, and you're just watching them go. That's all you're doing. You let them be there. Another way of framing it is like you're trying to make your thoughts, trying to look at them like the furniture in a room. Your client would never, ever say, yeah, I'm a chair. But yet he treats his thoughts that way. That's kind of funny. So you're trying to generate this acceptance that he is not his thoughts, and thoughts can be there, but he's not his thoughts. That gets right down to self as context work. So you see, like, you're really dancing in any single intervention. So let's see the clip here.
Yeah, minds are very unruly organs. They're judgmental organs. That's what they're there for. When we're out in the savannas and there's like danger around, like which would be more costly? Thinking there's danger when there isn't, or thinking that there's not danger when there is?
Thinking there's not danger.
You betcha. And so you guess, if you just actually watch your mind and you look at the judgments you make of yourself, what percentage do you suppose are negative?
75 at least.
75, 80%.
Yeah.
When I ask clients this is the answer I get. When I watch my own mind, this is the answer I get. And when I'm out of the savannah, I'm guessing that better be the answer or I'm going to be eaten.
Right.
Okay? So, there it goes again. Thank your mind for that thought. Trying to help you out with the negative judgment. Thank you very much. So let's just watch it for a moment. Like, what does your mind do even with what I'm saying right now?
My mind jumps up and says, that sounds really hard. You're not going to be able to do that.
Neat.
Forget about it.
Perfect. That's great. Out of mind.
Yeah. Thanks for helping out.
It's doing the best it can, and that's what it knows how to do. So let's just take that thought, and we'll just put that one out there.
Okay.
Okay? This is like another passenger, right?
Right.
Is there anything in that, just as a thought, that is harmful to you in your life? Must this be resisted, argued with, complied with? Or is it okay simply to have it as a thought?
So that struck me as very similar to internal family systems.
Yeah, there is a similarity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a
There's
similarity.
there's a heavy emphasis here on he's using self as context, so that's like there's different
It's
selves,
like the
you know,
self.
a similar idea. But,
How do they feel about feelings in this? It's the same thing, feelings in effect, right?
feelings, behavior? We do it. Yep, we'll have that.
Yeah, I'm feeling, same thing?
Yeah, same thing. And what you notice the way he's talking is he's encouraging the client to describe his painful experiences. You know, if someone's crying on the couch, you know, as a therapist, you really has a hesitancy to say good job. He dives right into it. He's giving positive reinforcement to express painful thoughts and let them be there. Hey, wait a second. Is there anything in this feeling or this thought that you can't have? Is it really? Will this end you? Can you have it? So there's the encouragement of having the feeling and noticing there's a difference. I can have this thing.
These mentioned comply. Do we have to comply with it? You said something. Is there anything in this thought that we have to comply
Yeah,
with?
no, we don't have to comply with it.
Right.
It can
that's
tell
nice.
us to jump off a roof, but do we have to listen to a thought? It's just a thought.
Just a thought. Thoughts are just thoughts.
Present moment. So this gets very, again, like ACT is at its base is an emotion, it's an exposure therapy. It's a sophisticated one, but it is just an exposure therapy. And the idea that they take on against, say, FOA and the classic model of exposure is you're not desensitizing people to their experience. You're trying to get them to experience more of it, but behave differently around it. When you're being exposed to things that cause you fear, acting not afraid, let's change the context big time. Behaving curiously and openly and asking questions and exploring the pain in exquisite detail. Well, number one, if we want to get more like the cognitivist friends, the reductionistic way of looking at things, this is actually what general anxiety is it's a very narrow experience of pain that is unable to cease. You know, with the emotion focused therapy folks, the way they put it is the only way to leave a feeling is to arrive at a feeling. So you're really trying to enable a person to arrive at the feeling to leave it. And when it's being exposed to your feelings and thoughts that are painful and behaving as though they're not, that's the cognitive the cognitive diffusion aspect of this is, well, oh, maybe it's okay, maybe it's just a thought and feeling. That you're, again, trying to increase flexibility, adding, as opposed to desensitization, which is trying to get rid of those relational frames. You're not going to do it. Yes, we'll see this.
I just feel like even when I'm in a room with 100 people that I'm still by myself, and I want to have friends and I want to go out, but I just feel alone no matter what I do. And when I'm at home, I'm really unhappy and really lonely, but I just can't be around anybody.
Can I have you go back to this statement that you made? I just really feel alone no matter what I do. Could you say that again for me? A little slower.
Because I used to have people calling me and...
So I'm just going to interrupt you gently again.
Okay.
And see if we can get you back to this moment, this space where this loneliness is showing up. Could you just, for me, one time say, I'm really feeling this loneliness.
I'm really feeling this loneliness.
Okay. And just stay there. Just be aware of what your body's doing. Notice your hands. Notice the little shimmer as you breathe in.
Yeah.
Notice the feel of the tears in your eyes and rolling down your cheeks. And let's just stay in this moment with this experience.
It's hard.
Yeah, now notice that your mind said that in this moment. And you just took a deep breath. Stay with it for just another few moments.
Well, I really feel that.
Okay, I'm going to slow you down again. And just with from a very gentle place,
Okay.
a very gentle place, ask you to stay and notice, that's all. Your breath. As you observe yourself, can you feel it changing? You feel it move in and out?
Yeah.
So what you notice here is that as a process, like you're experiencing an ongoing sense in each moment of sadness, your hands moving, tears rolling down your cheek. So one thing that your experience tells you is that you can stand it, and it keeps changing.
What's cool about this, you notice she interrupts the client several times.
Gently.
Yeah, but she's definitely interrupting because she's getting mindy. She's leaving her
Right.
present moment experience.
Right.
She's trying to rationalize the whys. What does it mean? No, let's not do that. Let's get out of that invading frame. Just feel it. And to notice in the moment, well, wait a second, feelings actually change. It might get harder, it might get easier. But when you're stuck in that mindy sort of place, you're upping that suffering because you don't want to touch that thing so much. You just don't want that thing at all. You're only going to experience it more and more. But it's not that you're feeling the feeling as much as it's almost like, Gottman and Leahy, the meta emotion guys. Like you're having a feeling on a feeling, and that's just not going to go away. You want to have them be in that feeling. Okay. Diffusion.
Okay, just,
Yeah.
the big issues with exposure therapy is the whole re-traumatization to do.
Right. Yes.
So-
So hold on a second,
Yeah.
because
I just
the-
wanna
the-
hold
that-
that
right.
one
yeah.
up,
Yeah.
We
wave
need-
the flag,
so right.
they don't reach.
Right. So no, the reason why you'll have re-traumatization in FOA's approach is because she does absolutely no values work. There's no motivation to feel the pain. There's no meaning behind it. All it is going to be terror. That's how you wind up ending into that mess. The ACT model takes from the research the idea that, well, once you've already gone through the functional analysis. Like the guy's committed. He wants change, and you're not starting that process until there's a certain level of commitment. But you're making it worth something. It's dignifying the suffering when you lay the values work down of what they want their life to be about.
Are you doing that before
Yes,
you're
you're
starting
absolutely
the
doing that before.
Okay,
You're
because that's
absolutely
not
doing
what we,
that
remember when
before.
we learned they didn't say it that way?
Absolutely doing that
They did
before.
not, they said after.
Yeah, it's more effective, and it causes a lot less pain, and that's, I don't know why.
So
I
you're
don't know why
creating
they
the
don't.
whole values hierarchy first,
Yep.
and you're, okay, that's why I was confused
100%.
about the whole ACT thing.
100%. Yep. Okay. So diffusion, again, this idea, the gum in the hair sort of idea, that we're breaking the connection between the feelings and thoughts we're having in the present and all the stuff we're lumping in on that. Now, there's all sorts of different techniques to pull back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz. The oldest one, I think it's about 100 years old, is the milk exercise. As a kid, you ever play this game where you just repeat a word over and over and over, and then it just starts to sound weird? That experience is diffusion. The meaning behind the word is what you feel first. Milk, something cold, something creamy. I like it in my coffee. But the more that you are saying the word over and over, you're separating those stimuli, those relational frames, the way you're relating to coffee, from its non-arbitrary qualities. The word milk sounds weird. So you have all these different sort of exercises to bring that out. So you'll do things like that, or maybe you'll play with whatever your fears. Fear of heights. You'll walk around with "I'm scared of heights" as a shirt. Just walk around with it. That's fine.
Sing
just
happy
a thought.
birthday.
Sing happy birthday, or you
Right,
have to
right,
whittle.
right.
You have to whittle down the thought to something short and easy to use clinically. But say it like you're Donald Duck, or
I had somebody do a whole comedy sketch about their fear.
Okay.
They had to get up on, do a whole shebang, whole stand-up comedy.
Right.
That's also fun.
Right. So there also is diffusion, that your fears are something that you can play with.
And that
that's
you
another.
can get other people to laugh at.
So there's thousands of diffusion techniques, and a lot of them, what their goal is not so much as an actual intervention in real life, but trying to orient the client to this experience of their thoughts are not real, in that sort of way. Clinically, actually, interestingly enough, it's just as effective. It's a little bit more effective than paced breathing and other classic behavioral calming techniques. The milk exercise is more effective than teaching someone how to do paced breathing. Or things like getting this distance from your feelings. Name your brain. My brain's name is Marshall. He's interesting. He has a lot of really good ideas, Marshall. And sometimes Marshall says dumb stuff. Sometimes he says weird stuff. Sometimes he says things that are scary.
Well, this is so good for kids. This one is
Marshall.
really good. Name the brain.
That's just what Marshall does. That's a diffusion technique, and that's an intervention you can use.
That's so good for kids.
Yeah, it's fun. Here, let's hit the video.
No one wants me. Would you say that again? Just say it again.
No one wants me.
Okay. Yeah. So there's some punch to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm having the feeling that I don't believe that when I say it. There are elements of it, sure.
Well, probably having a thought, actually belief is probably more like a thought, but having a thought that you don't believe it.
But I don't fully believe it.
Okay. So good. So notice that.
But clearly it's hit a nerve.
Yeah.
But I don't fully believe that.
Okay. And that's okay. Let's say it again.
I'm having the thought that I don't want to.
Okay. Okay. There's something in here that's sticky, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You're not making me cry. Not going to make me cry.
Yeah. That's been part of what's been going on, yeah. I'm not going to go there.
Well, what's the point?
Okay.
I mean...
Maybe the point is opening up a space in which it's okay to be you.
Mm.
These are not new tears, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're old.
Yeah.
Self is context as opposed to content. RFT proposes there's more, but there's 4 different types of selves. Content, which is the kind of similar to like CBT schemas.
Right.
So let's say you have like a wife who's having a hard marriage, guy's a bum, whatever it is, but she doesn't want to get a divorce. She's not that kind of woman.
Mm-hmm.
That would be self as content. I'm not that kind of woman. Self as process is more like a narrative perspective, maybe is a good way of thinking about it. It's like the life stories we tell ourselves, like the unfolding of behavior over years. I'm not that type of woman. What does that sort of woman do in a marriage like that? It's that life story. Well, self as context is finding a way to get distance from content, not that type of woman, and the process, the experience of what a bum, and looking at it with that distance, separating yourself from those, which really these cues, these things that are controlling your behavior, being thick in the content. What ends up happening is, you can find a lot of solutions when you get into that sort of place. Seeing those things unfold and those beliefs unfold classically, a story like this could lead a person to think, well, maybe a lot of the problems they're having isn't necessarily in the marriage as such, the content of the problem, but maybe she hasn't been solving her life story all these years, and this is just a lot of resentment that's built up, and you kind of getting that distance, detaching yourself from that, you might be able to see that. It opens up more treatment possibilities of, sure, you got to work on the marriage, but maybe you also have to work on this resentment issue, and how did you get there? Seeing both content and process from this position.
Try to, turn this into a big heady thing. I just want you to sort of catch that experientially.
All right.
Let's take it in a slightly different direction. You started to go there already. How about an emotion? Catch an emotion that you're feeling right now.
Sadness.
Okay. Spend a moment just sort of getting in touch with sort of a sense of sadness. Can you get in touch with that?
Yeah.
Now this is going to be stickier than a bodily sensation. It's a little harder to catch the distinction. But I want you to go into that sort of sense of sadness and really look right at it. You got it? And now I want you to notice who's noticing the sadness. We're going to sit with that for a bit, and then I'm going to try to link all of these things together, and you'll see that in this next segment. The same thing with sadness. Let's take like that feeling in your chest. Okay, here it is. It's right here. Okay, look at it. Are you it?
No.
Okay, we're going to put it back. Now I'm going to take sadness. Here's sadness. There's a conscious human being in here. There's a person who's aware of your whole history, sitting right in front of me, who's lived this out. Here's your sadness. Are you the sadness?
No.
In the interest of time, I've already given a fair explanation of values, work, and committed action, so it might be nice just to see the videos.
Okay, so let's move to those.
So, Julie, we spent a lot of time already talking about the different struggles that you've had with social anxiety and how you feel like you've been fighting this for a long time, and it really stands in the way of you kind of having the relationships that you want, and you've been really working hard to overcome it.
Yeah.
And part of what I was wondering about is if we could spend a little time kind of looking at the bigger picture of what are your dreams and your goals in terms of your relationships. Like if you could sort of have your relationships be however you would want them. Like if it were just so simple that you could just you had like a bowl of prizes and you could just reach in and just pull out the kind of relationships that you wanted. What would those look like for you?
Well, I'd like to have someone who I want to call up and share good news. I'd want to have good news. And I want to have, obviously a boyfriend at some point. I haven't had one in years. And I just want to have friends that are relationships that don't feel like a chore to tend to.
So I hear a couple of things in there. You'd want you'd want to have it feel like it was a choice. Like you'd really want to have relationships that really sort of felt meaty to you, or felt like that they were important to you.
Yeah.
That seem right?
Yeah.
Is there any other thing else I missed in there? I feel like there was like a first piece that I sort of missed in there.
Just being able to share good news. Feeling...
So you want people in your life where you felt like kind of connected enough to and close enough to that you would want to share, good news with them.
Yeah.
And that they would be there for you.
Yeah.
Does that feel right? Like that's sort of the kind of relationships you want.
Yeah, that feels right.
Has there ever been a time in your life where you felt like you had those kind of relationships?
Yeah, as a kid, I had no problems being social. I was always out playing with everyone, and it really wasn't a problem until, I don't know, maybe I was 13-ish. When I started moving into adolescence, I just started doubting myself a lot. And
who was your best friend back then when you, can you remember?
Yeah. Megan Myers.
And what was that friendship like?
I could spend the night at her house and not come home for 3 days, and it didn't matter, I felt safe next to someone, which I haven't felt in a really long time.
Is that something you'd want to have again in your life? That sort of sense of feeling so connected to somebody and so there with them that you felt safe to be able to just be just who you were with them?
Yeah, I definitely would.
So, here he's confronting the rule governed behavior, there's a history, this is the way friendship works, and it's a hard go for his client.
Well, what were the rules that you were saying?
He's avoiding getting stuck in them, instead of going through and hearing about all the people who have left her and not worked out. The rule is friendships don't work, basically. So he avoids that first through metaphor, reaching in, what would you like? So we're approaching this whole conversation from a way she's never had a conversation like that before. So you kind of escape those relational frames using a metaphor. And it's, what do you want, what do you want, what do you want? More classic therapy sort of stuff, trying to outline a roadmap.
I like that he talked about reaching in and getting the prize, and then did you see her hand move?
Yeah.
She got into it. She's like, oh, okay.
We have one
more. It's 2 minutes, so that okay?
It's hardest for me to have this cup in my hand.
Because, go inside it, the cup itself isn't what's hard here.
Because I know you want me to reach in there and touch that disgusting, filthy dirt.
Right, and if you did?
And if I did, it would be on me, and I can't even think of that, about what it to actually touch the stuff and have it on me, and I might get it on you. I might get on these clothes, and I will probably...
I'm going to ask you to get it on me, actually. We'll deal with that when we get there. We'll see. So, in other words, what's hard about this is these thoughts. These are thoughts. So we're going to get with the dirt, but I want you also to sort of watch what's going on in your body. What's showing up. And emotions, what's showing up.
Well, physically, I can feel that I'm trying to keep this as far away from my body as possible, from my trunk. The sitting position, if I could push my arms any further away, I would.
Well, then why don't you bring the palm forward? That's it. Okay. You can just use this like a reverse compass. Whose life is this, anyway?
And what else am I doing? I'm trying as hard as I can to not move my fingers.
Okay, so I'd ask you to move your fingers. Good. Good that you noticed that.
All right, I'm going to withdraw my hand a little bit so I can look in this cup.
Okay. Okay. What else is your mind telling you? Especially, I think it's really good to watch for things that it tells you not to do.
Well,
we want to catch these little moves to go away.
It's telling me to not smush it around much because it might grind into me.
Okay, good. So thank your mind for that good advice. And why don't you put it right in there and just squish it around with it.
All right. Ugh.
What's cool about ACT is it's fun. There's a certain it's flexibility. It's being open. It's being in the moment, and there's the curiosity you can't escape from. So, combining all 6 processes of change and bringing them together, what you ultimately are creating in the room is life, a life that you can have, that you can hold, and being open towards it is the transformative experience. Leveraging all these different processes together in every stage in the session and throughout the whole treatment.
I
Yeah.
have a question, like if he was suffering from that hair pulling OCD, you know, when they blend, how, I mean, you wouldn't make them pull their hair.
You know, ACT is the only,
Just curious.
that's very difficult to treat, and ACT has the highest success rate in
So
treatment of that. It happens to be, yeah.
So what,
Yeah.
so instead of putting
And the
hand-
zit popping and the straight.
Same thing, same processes.
So what I'm asking you, how do you, you don't want them to pull out the hair.
You
I
don't
wouldn't
want
mind
to
if
pull
I
out, so it
could
would be
do
the
it.
experience of no. The
experience of wanting to.
Of wanting to, and what's it
Yeah.
like to feel it, and man, you know, that's really interesting, where else do you feel it? And you're exploring that want, that need of having to pull the hair. You're learning you can hold it and carry it, and you don't have to pull the hair.
Okay.
It's okay, it can be there.
But would he make you put your hand on your hair?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
And not pull.
And not pull, yeah.
Yeah, notice your fingers touching your hair.
And don't pull.
It's great.
So it was interesting, you know, what generates the negative aspects of fear
Yeah.
is really the avoidance aspect. The cortisol buildup, which is, you know, the toxins that really are just knocking you down with things like anxiety. When you approach them, you don't get those on a biological level. So it's counterintuitive. Like, you think, well, if you're afraid of something, run away. But on an emotional level,
Avoiding it
when
is
you
a
have
failure.
fear and move
Yeah.
towards it, biologically you don't get that cortisol. Like, in your bones, it's a different experience. The more you move towards that anxiety.
It's an addiction.
Yeah, you know, like, we also notice he's a little playful with it also. There is some laughing, and there is some, but you're right, he's holding pain.
That's interesting. I see that with a lot of my clients. I make them stay with the sadness, or make them stay with this, and part of all their dysfunction is they're running away from it.
Yeah.
You know, they talk about their marriage and their unhappiness, and okay, tell me about the unhappiness.
You know, and it's
they start to cry, and they'll go home and say, I was miserable all week.
Yeah.
So good.
These sort of things, these present moment interventions, even with ACT clinicians knowing that this is where you want to run towards, you want to run towards pain, when you actually like sit down and start doing research on what of the 6 do therapists actually use most, this is the least used. The present moment experiences, because like we as therapists don't want to see people suffering. It's kind of like we avoid it, because we're avoidance machines too, because well, we don't want to see someone care about going through all of that, but they need to learn that they're strong, defragilize them. Ultimately, these are people.
So they have more grit.
People are strong.
Grit.
People are strong.
That is
People
the
are
thing.
strong.
fragile.
People will not fall
People are
apart.
fragile. They might have developed the experience of being fragile, but the goal is defragilization. That's the point.
I want to thank you, Yonasan, for that great presentation. We have all learned